I can make you walk again. These 6 words would shatter the bitter silence of a mansion where hope had died. Spoken by a housekeeper to a millionaire who had spent 3 years believing his life. Tonight, you're about to witness how one woman's courage to speak an impossible truth would transform 2 lives forever, proving that sometimes miracles come in the form of someone everyone else overlooks. If you're ready to believe in the power of hope when it seems impossible, in the strength of the human spirit when it's been broken, and in the healing that can happen when 2 unlikely souls refuse to give up on each other, hit that like button right now, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell. Because this story will restore your faith in the impossible and remind you that sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't found in hospitals or laboratories, but in the hands of someone who refuses to accept that healing isn't possible. Let's dive into this extraordinary story of second chances and medical miracles. The October rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Blackwood estate, each drop echoing through the cavernous rooms of the Beverly Hills mansion like tears the house itself was crying. The 15,000-square-foot home, once the pinnacle of architectural achievement and the crown jewel of California's most exclusive neighborhood, had become a monument to bitterness and abandoned dreams. In the mahogany-paneled study that overlooked the estate's perfectly manicured gardens, Daniel Blackwood sat motionless in his custom titanium wheelchair, staring at financial reports that no longer held any meaning for him. At 38 years old, he was still considered one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs of his generation, the founder and former CEO of Blackwood Innovations, a company that had revolutionized artificial intelligence and made him worth over $400 million before his 25th birthday. But that life, the life of conference keynotes and magazine covers, of 18-hour workdays and world-changing innovations, had ended 3 years ago on a rain-soaked highway outside San Francisco when a drunk driver had slammed into his Tesla at 70 miles per hour. The accident had left him paralyzed from the waist down, his spinal cord severed at the L2 vertebra, his dreams of changing the world replaced by the daily reality of managing a disability that the finest neurologists in the country had declared permanent and irreversible. The house that had once buzzed with the energy of parties and business meetings now felt like a mausoleum, its rooms filled with unused exercise equipment, abandoned physical therapy devices, and the ghosts of a man who had once believed he could accomplish anything. Daniel's world had shrunk to the dimensions of wheelchair accessibility, his horizon limited to what he could reach from a seated position, his future measured in the management of a condition rather than the pursuit of possibilities. Esperanza Morales moved through the mansion's rooms with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate around broken dreams without disturbing them. At 45 years old, she had been working as a housekeeper in Beverly Hills for over 20 years. Cleaning the homes of celebrities, politicians, and tech moguls who rarely acknowledged her presence beyond the weekly paycheck that appeared in her bank account. She had been caring for the Blackwood estate for 8 months, hired through an agency after Daniel's previous housekeeper had quit in frustration over his bitter moods and impossible demands. The job paid well, better than any position she had ever held. But it came with the challenge of working for a man who had retreated so completely from life that he seemed determined to make everyone around him as miserable as he was. Daniel's daily routine was predictable in its emptiness. He would wake at 10 a.m., transfer himself to his wheelchair with the mechanical precision of someone going through motions rather than living, and spend the day alternating between his study and the home gym that had been retrofitted for his disability. He rarely spoke to Esperanza beyond basic instructions. "The coffee is too weak. Don't move the papers on my desk. I'll eat dinner in the study again." But Esperanza had been observing Daniel for months with the careful attention of someone who had spent 2 decades learning to read the unspoken needs of her employers. She had noticed things that the parade of physical therapists, doctors and specialists seemed to miss. The way Daniel's legs sometimes responded to stimulation, the involuntary muscle contractions that suggested more neural activity than his medical reports indicated, the patterns of sensation that didn't align with a complete spinal cord injury. More importantly, she had noticed the medical journals that Daniel ordered and left scattered around the study, the research papers on spinal cord regeneration that he read obsessively, the experimental treatment protocols that he printed out and annotated with the desperate hope of someone searching for salvation in scientific literature. What Daniel didn't know was that Esperanza Morales had spent 15 years as a registered nurse in Guatemala before immigrating to the United States, specializing in neurological rehabilitation at Hospital Roosevelt, one of Central America's leading medical centers. Her credentials hadn't transferred to California. Her accent and immigration status had limited her employment options, and the necessity of supporting her 3 children as a single mother had forced her into domestic work rather than the medical career she had trained for. But she had never stopped being a nurse. She had never stopped seeing patients where others saw only employers, never stopped recognizing symptoms where others saw only inconvenience, never stopped believing in the possibility of healing where others saw only permanent disability. On this particular October afternoon, as rain continued to drum against the windows and Daniel sat staring at his financial reports with the hollow expression of someone going through the motions of living, Esperanza was cleaning the study when she noticed him wince and shift in his wheelchair. "Are you in pain, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying the professional concern that had been trained into her during years of hospital work. Daniel looked up, surprised by the question. In 8 months, Esperanza had never asked about his physical condition, had never offered medical opinions or unsolicited advice about his disability. "It's nothing," he said dismissively. "Just muscle spasms. The doctor said it's normal with this type of injury." But Esperanza had been watching him for weeks, had seen the patterns of discomfort that coincided with weather changes, the way he favored his left side, the subtle movements in his lower extremities that suggested incomplete neural pathways rather than total paralysis. "Mr. Blackwood," she said carefully, setting down her cleaning supplies, "may I ask you something about your accident?" Daniel's expression hardened. He had learned to shut down conversations about his injury, to deflect the well-meaning questions and unwanted advice that people seemed compelled to offer. "I'd prefer not to discuss it," he said coldly. "I understand," Esperanza said gently, "but I've been observing you for months, and I think your doctors may have missed something important." "My doctors are the finest neurologists in the country," Daniel snapped. "Stanford Medical, UCLA, Mayo Clinic. I've had every test, every scan, every experimental treatment protocol available. I've been told by world-renowned specialists that my spinal cord was completely severed, that there's no possibility of recovery below the level of injury." Esperanza nodded respectfully, but her expression remained thoughtful rather than convinced. "With respect, Mr. Blackwood, I've seen patients with incomplete spinal cord injuries who were initially diagnosed as complete paraplegics. The difference can be subtle, especially in the acute phase after trauma." Daniel stared at her, his annoyance giving way to confusion. "What are you talking about? You're a housekeeper, not a neurologist." "I'm a housekeeper now," Esperanza corrected gently. "But I was a registered nurse for 15 years in Guatemala, specializing in neurological rehabilitation. I worked with spinal cord injury patients, stroke victims, traumatic brain injury cases." The revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow. For 8 months, he had been living with a trained medical professional who had been observing his condition with expert eyes, and he had dismissed her as just another domestic worker whose opinion didn't matter. "You're a nurse," he said slowly. "I was a nurse. My credentials don't transfer to the United States, and I needed work immediately when I came here to support my children." Esperanza's voice carried no bitterness about her situation, only the practical acceptance of someone who had made necessary sacrifices. "But medical knowledge doesn't disappear just because you're cleaning houses instead of working in hospitals." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing this information and its implications for everything he thought he knew about his condition. "What exactly have you observed?" he asked finally, his business instincts engaging despite his emotional walls. Esperanza moved closer, her demeanor shifting from housekeeper to healthcare professional as she explained her observations with clinical precision. "Your muscle tone is better than it should be for someone with a complete L2 injury. You have reflexes in your lower extremities that shouldn't exist with total cord transection. Most importantly, you have voluntary movement in your hip flexors and some sensation in your upper thighs that your medical reports say should be impossible." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Blackwood, I believe you have an incomplete spinal cord injury, not a complete one. With the right rehabilitation protocol, with intensive physical therapy and neural stimulation techniques, there's a possibility of significant functional recovery." Daniel's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Do you have any idea how much money I've spent on rehabilitation? How many specialists I've consulted? How many experimental treatments I've tried? If there was any possibility of recovery, don't you think someone would have found it by now?" "Sometimes," Esperanza said quietly, "the most important discoveries are made by people who are looking with fresh eyes, who aren't limited by previous assumptions or institutional biases." She pulled out her phone and showed Daniel a medical journal article she had downloaded. "This research from the International Spinal Cord Society shows that up to 40% of patients initially diagnosed with complete spinal cord injuries actually have some degree of incomplete injury. The difference often isn't detected until months or years after the initial trauma, when scar tissue has stabilized and more sophisticated testing can be performed." Daniel stared at the article, his mind racing through the implications of what Esperanza was suggesting. "Even if you're right," he said finally, "even if my injury is incomplete rather than complete, that doesn't mean I'll walk again. Incomplete injuries can still result in permanent paralysis." "Yes," Esperanza agreed, "but they can also result in significant functional recovery, especially with intensive, targeted rehabilitation." "Mr. Blackwood, I've worked with patients who went from complete paralysis to independent ambulation with assistive devices. I've seen people regain bowel and bladder control, sexual function, the ability to stand and transfer independently." She leaned forward, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had witnessed medical miracles that others had dismissed as impossible. "But most importantly, I've seen people reclaim their lives, their purpose, their belief in their own possibilities. Even if you never walk normally again, even if you need assistive devices or mobility aids, the difference between hopelessness and hope, between believing you're finished and believing you're still becoming, that difference changes everything." Daniel was quiet for a long time, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens where he used to walk, where he used to run, where he used to believe the future was limitless. "What would you need?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you were going to try to help me, what would you need?" Esperanza's answer was immediate and specific, suggesting she had been thinking about this possibility for months. "Access to your complete medical files, including the original imaging studies from your accident. A consultation with a neurologist who specializes in incomplete spinal cord injuries, someone not connected to your previous medical team. Modern electromyography equipment to test nerve conduction and muscle response. And 6 months of intensive daily rehabilitation therapy following protocols specifically designed for incomplete injury recovery." "And if it doesn't work?" Daniel asked. "If I go through 6 months of hope and pain and still end up exactly where I am now?" Esperanza looked at him with the compassion of someone who understood that hope could be the most dangerous and necessary medicine of all. Then you'll know you tried everything possible, she said simply. Then you'll never have to wonder what if. And maybe, Mr. Blackwood, you'll discover that the person who refuses to give up is stronger than the person who gave up 3 years ago. The rain continued to fall against the windows. But for the first time in 3 years, the sound seemed less like tears and more like the promise of something new, being washed clean and ready to grow. Daniel Blackwood, who had spent 1,000 days believing his life was over, found himself considering the possibility that it might just be beginning again. And in the quiet of his study, surrounded by abandoned dreams and forgotten possibilities, a miracle was about to begin with the simple act of believing that healing wasn't finished with him yet. If this moment of impossible hope has stirred something in your heart, if Esperanza's courage to speak medical truth to someone who had given up has inspired you like it inspired me, then please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. Because what Daniel decides to do with this revelation, and whether Esperanza's medical intuition is right, will take you on an emotional journey that proves sometimes the most powerful healing happens when we find the courage to hope again. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Nudida. The silence in Daniel's study stretched for nearly 5 minutes after Esperanza finished speaking, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the windows and the soft ticking of the antique clock that had belonged to Daniel's grandfather. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was wrestling with something more complex than medical possibilities. Esperanza, he said slowly, if what you're suggesting is true, if my doctors missed something this fundamental, then I've spent 3 years of my life grieving a future that might still be possible. Yes, she said simply, not minimizing the weight of that realization. And I've treated you like a servant for 8 months, never bothering to ask about your background, your qualifications, your expertise, because I assumed that someone cleaning my house couldn't possibly have anything valuable to offer about my medical condition. Esperanza's expression remained gentle, without judgment. You've been in pain, Mr. Blackwood. Physical pain, emotional pain, spiritual pain. People in pain sometimes can't see clearly beyond their own suffering. Oh. Daniel looked down at his legs, at the expensive wool slacks that covered limbs he had written off as useless appendages, at the custom wheelchair that had become both his mobility and his prison. What you're proposing, he said finally, it's not just medical treatment. It's a complete reconstruction of how I see myself, how I see my future. If I allow myself to hope and then fail, the hoping won't be failure. Esperanza interrupted gently. The hoping will be healing, regardless of the physical outcome. You've been dead for 3 years, Mr. Blackwood. Not physically, but in every way that matters for living. Even if your legs never recover completely, getting your hope back, getting your fight back, that's recovery too. Daniel transferred himself from behind his desk to a position where he could look directly at Esperanza. And for the first time in their 8 months together, he really saw her, not as his housekeeper, but as a trained medical professional who had been observing his condition with expert eyes. Tell me about your experience, he said. Tell me about the patients you worked with in Guatemala. Esperanza settled into the chair across from him, her posture shifting as she accessed memories from her medical career. Hospital Roosevelt has one of the most advanced spinal cord rehabilitation units in Central America, she began. I worked there for 7 years before immigrating. We saw patients from all over the region. Car accidents, gunshot wounds, falls, sports injuries. Many came to us months or years after their initial treatment, often with diagnoses of complete paralysis. She paused, choosing her words carefully. There was a patient, Carlos Mendoza, 24 years old. Motorcycle accident, diagnosed with complete T12 injury. He came to us 8 months post-accident, completely hopeless, considering suicide. His family had spent their savings on treatments that hadn't worked. What happened to him? I noticed the same things I've noticed with you. Muscle tone that was too good, reflexes that shouldn't have existed, small movements that his doctors had dismissed as muscle spasms. We convinced the attending physician to order more sophisticated testing. Esperanza's voice grew stronger as she continued. The new tests showed incomplete injury with some preserved neural pathways. We developed an intensive rehabilitation protocol combining electrical stimulation, aquatic therapy, and progressive resistance training. Carlos worked 8 hours a day for 6 months. Daniel leaned forward despite himself. Did he walk again? He walked down the aisle at his wedding 18 months later, Esperanza said with quiet satisfaction. With forearm crutches and leg braces, but he walked. More importantly, he went back to school, became an accountant, started a family, built a life that was different from what he had planned, but no less meaningful. And you think I could have similar results? I think you have better neural preservation than Carlos had, Esperanza said honestly. I think your financial resources would allow for treatments and equipment that weren't available to him. And I think your intelligence and determination, once properly focused, could overcome obstacles that defeat other patients. Daniel was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that had been haunting him. Why didn't you say something earlier? Why wait 8 months to tell me this? Esperanza's answer revealed the careful observation and professional judgment that had guided her decision. Because you weren't ready to hear it. For the first 6 months I worked here, you were still angry, still fighting against your situation, rather than accepting it as a starting point for something new. Anger uses energy that healing needs. You had to finish grieving who you used to be before you could begin becoming who you might still be. The psychological insight behind her timing impressed Daniel almost as much as her medical observations. And now you think I'm ready? Now you're bored instead of angry, Esperanza said with a slight smile. Now you're going through the motions of being disabled rather than actively fighting disability. Now you have space in your life for hope because you've stopped filling it with bitterness. Daniel laughed, the first genuine laugh Esperanza had heard from him in 8 months. So my emotional recovery has been a prerequisite for my potential physical recovery. Healing isn't just medical, Mr. Blackwood. It's psychological, spiritual, social. You can have perfect neural function and still be paralyzed by fear, depression, or lack of purpose. You can have incomplete physical recovery and still reclaim a complete life. Daniel transferred back to his desk and picked up his phone, his business instincts fully engaged now. If we're going to do this, he said, we're going to do it right. I want consultations with the best incomplete spinal cord injury specialists in the world. I want access to experimental equipment that isn't available in standard rehabilitation facilities. I want a team approach with neurologists, physiatrists, physical therapists, occupational therapists, and you as the coordinating medical professional. Esperanza felt a surge of both excitement and apprehension. Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your confidence, but I'm not licensed to practice medicine in the United States. I can advise and observe, but I can't be the primary medical professional on your treatment team. Then we'll fix that too, Daniel said with the decisive tone of someone accustomed to solving complex problems through the application of resources and determination. Immigration attorney, credential evaluation, accelerated nursing certification program if necessary. If you're going to help save my life, Esperanza, then I'm going to help you reclaim your career. The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Esperanza felt tears prick at her eyes. Mr. Blackwood, that would cost. I have $400 million, and no life worth spending it on, Daniel interrupted. If there's a chance that you can help me walk again, if there's a chance that I can help you practice medicine again, then money becomes the least important part of this equation. He looked out at the rain-soaked gardens, but this time his expression carried possibility rather than regret. Besides, he added, I built my fortune by betting on technologies that other people said were impossible. Maybe it's time I applied that same philosophy to human potential. As the afternoon wore on, Daniel and Esperanza began sketching out the framework for what would become one of the most intensive private spinal cord rehabilitation programs ever attempted. Phone calls to medical schools and rehabilitation centers, research into experimental protocols, consultations with specialists who had achieved remarkable results with incomplete injury patients. But more than the medical planning, what struck Esperanza was the transformation in Daniel's energy, his focus, his sense of purpose. For the first time since the accident, he was planning for a future that extended beyond the management of disability. "There's something else," Esperanza said as the afternoon light began to fade. "Something I haven't told you about why I think your case is so promising." Daniel looked up from his notes. "I've been watching you work," she continued. "I've seen you design and build adaptive technologies for your wheelchair, modify computer interfaces for hands-only operation, create solutions for problems that no commercial products address. Your brain is still the same innovative problem-solving brain that built Blackwood Innovations. Your point being?" "My point being that neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new neural pathways, is enhanced by intellectual challenge, by creative problem-solving, by the kind of innovative thinking that you've never stopped doing. Your rehabilitation won't just be physical therapy. It will be engineering challenges, technological innovation, the application of your expertise to the problem of your own recovery." For the first time in 3 years, Daniel Blackwood found himself excited about tomorrow, about the possibilities that morning might bring, about the chance to apply his intelligence and resources to the most important project of his life, the reclamation of life itself. The rain was still falling, but the sound had changed from mourning to promise, from endings to beginnings, from tears to the gentle baptism of second chances. And in a Beverly Hills mansion that had become a monument to abandoned dreams, 2 unlikely partners were about to embark on a journey that would prove that sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't found in hospitals or laboratories, but in the courage to believe that healing is always possible, that second chances can happen at any age, and that the most important discoveries are often made by people who refuse to accept that miracles are finished with them yet. 6 weeks later, the Blackwood estate had been transformed from a monument to despair into a state-of-the-art rehabilitation facility. The mansion's west wing had been converted into a medical center that rivaled the equipment found at major hospitals, with specialized therapy pools, functional electrical stimulation devices, gait training systems, and monitoring equipment that could track neural activity in real time. Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the world's leading experts in incomplete spinal cord injury rehabilitation, had flown in from Johns Hopkins to oversee Daniel's treatment protocol. Her initial examination had confirmed Esperanza's suspicions. Daniel's injury was indeed incomplete, with significantly more preserved neural pathways than his original medical team had detected. "It's actually more common than people realize," Dr. Chen explained to Daniel and Esperanza during their morning consultation. "The difference between complete and incomplete spinal cord injuries can be subtle, especially in the acute phase following trauma. Swelling, scar tissue formation, and the body's initial inflammatory response can mask preserved neural function for months or even years." She showed them Daniel's latest MRI results, pointing to areas of the spinal cord that showed unexpected activity. "What we're seeing here suggests that approximately 30 to 40% of your neural pathways below the level of injury remained intact. They've been dormant, essentially shut down by the trauma and subsequent scar tissue formation, but they're still viable." Daniel studied the images with the same intensity he had once applied to technological innovations. "So the question is whether we can reactivate those dormant pathways." "Exactly. And based on your response to our initial electrical stimulation tests, I'm optimistic that we can achieve significant functional recovery. The rehabilitation protocol that Dr. Chen and Esperanza had developed was unlike anything Daniel had experienced in his previous treatments. Rather than focusing solely on maintaining muscle mass and preventing complications, this program aimed to stimulate neural regeneration through a combination of cutting-edge medical technology and intensive physical therapy. Each day began at 6 a.m. with electrical stimulation therapy, using sophisticated devices that sent precise electrical pulses to Daniel's spinal cord and lower extremities. The goal was to wake up dormant neural pathways and encourage the formation of new connections between surviving nerve fibers. Think of it like rebooting a computer system, Esperanza explained as she helped Daniel into the electrical stimulation apparatus. Your spinal cord has been running on limited processing power for 3 years. We're trying to bring the full system back online. The therapy was intense and often painful. The electrical pulses caused involuntary muscle contractions that left Daniel exhausted and sometimes discouraged. But within the first 2 weeks, both he and Esperanza began noticing changes that the sophisticated monitoring equipment confirmed. "Look at this," Dr. Chen said, showing them readouts from Daniel's latest nerve conduction tests. "We're seeing increased electrical activity in neural pathways that showed no function 6 weeks ago. Your body is literally rebuilding connections that were lost in the accident. The physical changes were subtle, but unmistakable." Daniel began experiencing sensation in areas of his legs that had been completely numb for 3 years. Muscle tone improved dramatically, and he started showing voluntary movement in muscle groups that had been completely paralyzed. But perhaps more importantly, Daniel's entire approach to his disability had changed. Instead of seeing his condition as a fixed limitation to be managed, he now approached it as an engineering challenge to be solved. "I want to design better equipment," he announced one afternoon, as Esperanza helped him with range of motion exercises. "The gait training system we're using is 20 years behind what's possible with current sensor technology and AI programming." "What do you mean?" Esperanza asked, though she was beginning to recognize the look Daniel got when his innovative mind was fully engaged with the problem. "I mean that we could create adaptive rehabilitation equipment that responds to individual patient progress in real time, that adjusts resistance and support based on neural feedback, that learns from each session and optimizes the next one." Daniel transferred himself to his computer and began sketching out designs for adaptive rehabilitation technology that could revolutionize spinal cord injury treatment. "If this works for me," he said, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who had rediscovered his purpose, "if we can demonstrate significant functional recovery using these protocols, then we need to make this accessible to other people who've been told their paralysis is permanent." Esperanza watched him work, recognizing in his renewed passion the same dedication that had built his technology empire, now focused on the most personal and meaningful project of his life. "You're thinking about other patients," she observed. "I'm thinking about Carlos Mendoza and all the other patients you worked with in Guatemala who didn't have access to this level of treatment. I'm thinking about the thousands of people sitting in wheelchairs right now, believing their lives are over because they've been told their injuries are complete when they might actually be incomplete." 3 months into the program, the breakthrough came in a way that surprised everyone, including Dr. Chen. Daniel was working on the standing frame, a device that supported his weight while electrical stimulation encouraged his leg muscles to bear load, when Esperanza noticed something unusual in his muscle response patterns. "Dr. Chen," she called out, "you need to see this." On the monitoring screen, they could see electrical activity patterns that indicated voluntary muscle activation. Daniel was somehow consciously controlling muscles that had been completely paralyzed for 3 years. "I can feel it," Daniel said, his voice filled with wonder. "I can feel my quadriceps contracting. I'm telling them to contract, and they're responding." Dr. Chen quickly ran additional tests, confirming what the monitors were showing. After 3 months of intensive rehabilitation, Daniel had regained conscious control over several major muscle groups in his legs. "This is remarkable," Dr. Chen said. "We're seeing the kind of neural recovery that typically takes years to achieve, if it happens at all." But the real test came 2 weeks later, when Daniel attempted to stand without the support frame for the first time since his accident. With Esperanza on one side and Dr. Chen on the other, Daniel gripped the parallel bars and slowly shifted his weight forward. His legs trembled with the effort, muscles that hadn't supported his weight in over 3 years, struggling to remember their function. "Take your time," Esperanza said softly. "Your body is remembering how to do something it thought it had forgotten." Inch by inch, Daniel raised himself from the wheelchair. His legs shook violently, and sweat beaded on his forehead from the enormous effort, but for the first time in 3 years and 4 months, Daniel Blackwood was standing on his own legs. He held the position for only 30 seconds before exhaustion forced him back into the wheelchair. But those 30 seconds represented more than just physical achievement. They represented the resurrection of hope, the reclamation of possibility, the proof that healing could happen when everyone else had given up. "How does it feel?" Dr. Chen asked, her professional composure not quite hiding her emotional response to witnessing such a dramatic recovery. Daniel looked up at Esperanza, tears streaming down his face, unable to speak for several moments. "It feels like coming back to life," he said finally. "It feels like getting a second chance to be the person I was meant to be." As news of Daniel's remarkable recovery spread through the medical community, rehabilitation specialists from around the world began reaching out to learn about the protocols that had achieved such dramatic results. Dr. Chen was invited to present their case study at the International Spinal Cord Society's annual conference, and medical journals were requesting detailed documentation of their innovative treatment approach. But for Esperanza, the most meaningful recognition came in a letter that arrived from Hospital Roosevelt in Guatemala. "Dear Esperanza, we have followed with great pride your work with Mr. Blackwood. Your innovative rehabilitation protocols and your courageous advocacy for incomplete spinal cord injury patients have brought international attention to approaches that we pioneered together. We would like to formally invite you to return to Guatemala as the director of our new International Spinal Cord Rehabilitation Center, with full recognition of your American training and experience. We believe you have become one of the world's leading experts in neural recovery, and we want you to lead our efforts to bring these advanced treatments to patients throughout Central and South America." The offer represented everything Esperanza had dreamed of, a chance to return to medicine at the highest level, to lead innovative research, to help patients who couldn't afford the kind of treatment that Daniel's wealth had made possible. But it also meant leaving California, leaving Daniel at a crucial stage of his recovery, leaving the partnership that had transformed both of their lives. When she showed the letter to Daniel, his response surprised her. "You have to take it," he said immediately. "This is your chance to get back to who you were meant to be, to help patients on a scale that goes far beyond just me." "But your recovery isn't complete," Esperanza protested. "You're walking short distances now, but you still need intensive therapy, ongoing treatment." "And I'll continue to need those things," Daniel agreed. "But what I needed most, what you gave me, was hope. You gave me back my life, Esperanza. Now I want to help you reclaim yours." He paused, then smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had found the perfect solution to a complex problem. "Besides, I have a proposal for you. What if the Blackwood Foundation funded the new rehabilitation center? What if we could create a partnership that brings the most advanced spinal cord injury treatments to patients throughout the Americas, regardless of their ability to pay?" The idea was breathtaking in its scope and generosity, using Daniel's fortune to democratize access to the kind of medical miracles that had restored his mobility. ensuring that patients like Carlos Mendoza could receive world-class treatment regardless of their financial circumstances. "You would do that?" Esperanza asked. "I would be honored to do that," Daniel corrected. "You saved my life, Esperanza. Now let's save some other lives together." As they sat in the study where Esperanza had first dared to suggest that Daniel might walk again, surrounded by the medical equipment and rehabilitation technology that had made the impossible possible, both of them understood that their partnership had created something much more significant than one man's recovery. They had proven that healing could happen when people refused to accept that it was impossible, that miracles could be engineered through the application of knowledge, determination, and hope, and that sometimes the most important medical breakthroughs came from the collaboration between conventional expertise and innovative thinking. 6 months earlier, Daniel Blackwood had been a broken man in a wheelchair, convinced that his life was over. Esperanza Morales had been a talented nurse working as a housekeeper, her medical expertise hidden behind immigration barriers and economic necessity. Now, Daniel was walking independently with the aid of forearm crutches, preparing to return to work as the head of a new foundation dedicated to spinal cord injury, research, and treatment. Esperanza was preparing to become the director of international spinal cord rehabilitation, with the resources to bring advanced neural recovery treatments to patients across 2 continents. But more importantly, both of them had learned that healing wasn't just about recovering from injury. It was about discovering that second chances were always possible, that hope was always worth the risk, and that sometimes the most powerful medicine was the simple act of refusing to give up on each other. The miracle hadn't been the technology or the medical protocols, or even the neural regeneration that had restored Daniel's ability to walk. The miracle had been the moment when 2 people chose to believe that impossible things were still possible, and decided to prove it together. 1 year later, the International Spinal Cord Rehabilitation Center in Guatemala City had become a beacon of hope for patients throughout Central and South America. The facility, funded by the Blackwood Foundation and directed by Dr. Esperanza Morales, had treated over 200 patients using the innovative protocols developed during Daniel's recovery. The results had exceeded even Esperanza's most optimistic projections. 60% of patients diagnosed with complete spinal cord injuries were found to have incomplete injuries upon sophisticated re-evaluation. Of those, over 40% had achieved significant functional recovery, with many returning to independent living and employment. But perhaps the most remarkable case was Carlos Mendoza himself, the patient Esperanza had treated years earlier in Guatemala, who had traveled to the new Center for Advanced Rehabilitation that had previously been unavailable in Central America. "Dr. Morales," Carlos said, as he walked into her office using only a single forearm crutch, his gait steady and confident, "I came to thank you for giving me back my life twice." Esperanza looked up from her patient files, delighted to see the young man who had inspired her to believe in neural recovery, even when conventional medicine suggested it was impossible. "Carlos, you look wonderful. How are Maria and the children?" "Growing too fast," Carlos laughed. "Miguel is 8 now and Sofia is 6. They both want to be doctors like you when they grow up." Carlos settled into the chair across from her desk, his expression growing more serious. "I wanted you to know that what you've built here, what you and Mr. Blackwood have created, it's changing everything. Not just for patients like me, but for how doctors think about spinal cord injury, how families cope with disability, how society treats people who are different." He gestured toward the rehabilitation floor, visible through her office window, where dozens of patients were working with state-of-the-art equipment and innovative therapy protocols. "My cousin Eduardo broke his back in a construction accident 6 months ago. The doctors in Honduras told his family he would never walk again, that they should take him home and make him comfortable. Instead, they brought him here. How is he responding to treatment? He took his first independent steps yesterday, Carlos said with pride. 10 steps without assistance, without support. His wife cried so hard she couldn't speak. Stories like Eduardo's had become common at the center, but they never lost their power to move Esperanza. Each recovery represented not just restored mobility, but reclaimed hope, rebuilt families, renewed faith in possibilities that medical convention had dismissed as impossible. Her computer chimed with an incoming video call, and Daniel's familiar face appeared on the screen. He was calling from his office at the Blackwood Foundation's headquarters in San Francisco, where he had returned to work full-time 6 months earlier. "Good morning, partner," Daniel said, grinning at the camera. "How are our patients doing today?" "Morning, Daniel. Carlos is here. He wanted to thank you personally for the scholarship program that brought Eduardo from Honduras." Daniel's expression grew warm as Carlos moved into frame. "Carlos, I remember your case from Esperanza's files. You're the inspiration for everything we've built here. How does it feel to see other people getting the same chance you did?" "It feels like miracles are becoming normal," Carlos replied. "Like hope is becoming medicine." "I love that," Daniel said. "Hope is becoming medicine. I'm stealing that for our next board meeting." Esperanza had been watching Daniel carefully during their video calls, noting the continued improvement in his mobility and strength. He was now walking independently for several hours each day, using forearm crutches only for longer distances or when fatigue set in. But more importantly, she had observed the transformation in his sense of purpose, his engagement with life, his excitement about the future. The bitter, isolated man she had met 18 months earlier had been replaced by someone whose energy and enthusiasm reminded her of the innovative entrepreneur he had been before his accident. "Speaking of the board meeting," Daniel continued, "I have some news. The National Institutes of Health has approved our grant application for the multi-center clinical trial. We're going to be able to test our rehabilitation protocols at 12 major medical centers across the United States and Canada. The approval represented a massive validation of their work and a pathway to making their treatment approach available to thousands of patients who couldn't travel to Guatemala for rehabilitation." "That's incredible," Esperanza said. "How many patients will we be able to treat?" "The initial trial will include 500 patients over 3 years," Daniel replied. "But if the results match what we've achieved in Guatemala, this could change the standard of care for spinal cord injury treatment worldwide." After the call ended and Carlos left to continue his own therapy session, Esperanza remained in her office, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 18 months ago, she had been cleaning floors and emptying trash cans, her medical expertise hidden behind the invisibility of domestic work. Now she was directing an internationally recognized rehabilitation center, publishing research in leading medical journals, training doctors and therapists from around the world in innovative neural recovery techniques. But the most profound change hadn't been in her professional status or her financial circumstances. It had been in her understanding of how healing actually worked, how hope could be engineered through the application of knowledge and determination, how impossible things could become possible when the right people refused to give up. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her daughter, now a sophomore at UCLA, studying biomedical engineering. "Mom, my neuroscience professor just assigned your latest research paper as required reading for his graduate seminar. He called your work revolutionary. I'm so proud of you for never giving up on helping people, even when it seemed impossible." Esperanza felt tears prick at her eyes as she realized that her sacrifice, leaving medicine to work as a housekeeper so she could support her children's education, had ultimately led to achievements that exceeded anything she could have accomplished if she had never left Guatemala. Sometimes the longest path to your dreams turned out to be the only path that could actually get you there. As the afternoon wore on, Esperanza made her rounds through the rehabilitation center, observing therapy sessions, consulting with patients, adjusting treatment protocols based on individual progress. Each room contained its own miracle in progress, people who had been told they would never walk again, taking their first steps. Families reunited with hope they thought they had lost forever. Medical professionals witnessing recoveries they had been trained to believe were impossible. In the hydrotherapy pool, she watched a young mother from El Salvador, working on balance and coordination exercises, preparing to return home to her 3 children after 6 months of intensive rehabilitation. In the electrical stimulation laboratory, a teenager from Mexico was showing remarkable neural recovery after a diving accident that had initially left him completely paralyzed. But perhaps the most moving scene was in the family conference room, where a doctor was explaining to parents from rural Guatemala that their son's injury was incomplete rather than complete, that recovery was possible, that hope was not only appropriate but medically indicated. "Doctor, Morales taught us that seeing is believing," the doctor was saying, "but sometimes believing is seeing. Sometimes we have to believe in recovery before we can see it, have to hope for healing before we can achieve it." Audrey, as Esperanza walked through the center that evening, after the patients had finished their therapy sessions and the families had gathered for dinner in the cafeteria, she found herself in the small chapel that had been built at Daniel's request, a quiet space for reflection, prayer, and gratitude. On the wall was a simple plaque that read, "Dedicated to everyone who refuses to believe that miracles are finished with us yet." Below it was a photo from Daniel's first day walking independently, an image of a man who had spent 3 years believing his life was over, taking steps toward a future he had thought was impossible. Beside it was another photo from the center's opening day, dozens of patients and families celebrating the beginning of their own journeys toward recovery, toward hope, toward the radical possibility that healing was always available to those who refused to give up. As Esperanza sat in the quiet chapel, thinking about the journey that had brought her from a mansion in Beverly Hills to a rehabilitation center in Guatemala City, she understood that the real miracle hadn't been any single recovery or medical breakthrough. The real miracle had been the discovery that healing was always possible when people chose to believe in each other, when expertise was combined with hope, when resources were devoted to proving that impossible things could become possible through the application of love disguised as medicine. Tomorrow, new patients would arrive at the center, carrying their own stories of trauma and loss, their own fears that life as they had known it was over. And tomorrow, Esperanza would begin the process of teaching them what Daniel had learned, what Carlos had learned, what hundreds of other patients had discovered in these rooms, that the end of one life could be the beginning of another, that limitations could become launching points, that sometimes the most powerful healing happened when people who had been broken refused to stay broken, refused to let others stay broken, and chose instead to build something beautiful from the pieces. The miracle was still happening, one patient at a time, one step at a time, one moment of impossible hope at a time. And in a world that often forgot that healing was possible, that second chances were available, that miracles were still being written in hospitals and rehabilitation centers and quiet moments of refusing to give up, the Blackwood Center stood as proof that sometimes the most extraordinary things happened when ordinary people decided that love was stronger than despair, that hope was more powerful than fear, and that the human spirit was capable of recovering from anything when it had help from people who believed recovery was possible. 5 years after Esperanza Morales had first uttered the words, "I can make you walk again," to Daniel Blackwood, the International Conference on Neural Recovery convened at the Colorado Convention Center in Denver, bringing together over 3,000 medical professionals, researchers, and patients from around the world to share the latest advances in spinal cord injury rehabilitation. The keynote address was being delivered by Dr. Esperanza Morales, now recognized as one of the world's leading experts in incomplete spinal cord injury recovery and the recipient of the International Spinal Cord Society's Lifetime Achievement Award for her groundbreaking research and patient care innovations. Standing at the podium before an audience that included Nobel laureates, department chairs from major medical schools, and healthcare officials from dozens of countries, Esperanza looked remarkably different from the housekeeper who had once cleaned floors in Beverly Hills. Her bearing radiated the confidence of someone who had not only reclaimed her medical career, but had revolutionized an entire field of medicine. 5 years ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the convention center's sound system, I was working as a housekeeper for a man who had been told by the finest neurologists in the world that he would never walk again. Today, that man is the chairman of the board of the largest spinal cord injury research foundation in the Americas, and he walked 2 miles this morning before breakfast. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the audience, many of whom were familiar with the Blackwood case study that had challenged fundamental assumptions about spinal cord injury prognosis and treatment. But I'm not here to talk about miraculous recoveries or medical breakthroughs, Esperanza continued. I'm here to talk about something more important, the danger of giving up on people too quickly, the cost of accepting limitations as permanent when they might be temporary, and the responsibility we have as medical professionals to see possibilities where others see only problems. In the third row, Daniel Blackwood sat listening to his former housekeeper address an audience of the world's most distinguished medical professionals. He was using forearm crutches today. His mobility varied depending on weather, stress levels, and the intensity of his physical therapy schedule. But his presence at the conference represented far more than personal recovery. Beside him sat Maria Santos, a young woman from Honduras, whose complete recovery from a diving accident had been documented in the New England Journal of Medicine as one of the most remarkable cases of neural regeneration ever recorded. Next to her was Dr. James Mitchell, a former patient who had become a rehabilitation physician specializing in incomplete spinal cord injuries, inspired by his own recovery to dedicate his career to helping others achieve similar results. The audience represented the global impact of the work that had begun in a Beverly Hills mansion, with a conversation between two people who refused to accept that healing was impossible. The protocols we've developed, Esperanza continued, have been successfully implemented at over 100 medical centers in 23 countries. We've treated more than 2,000 patients, with functional recovery rates that exceed 60% among those initially diagnosed with complete injuries. She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics that had transformed the medical understanding of spinal cord injury prognosis. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The real measure of our success isn't in the percentage of patients who regain mobility. It's in the restoration of hope for families who had been told to prepare for permanent disability, the reclamation of dreams that had been abandoned as impossible, the discovery that healing doesn't always follow the timeline or trajectory that medical textbooks describe. In the audience, Dr. Sarah Chen, now the Director of Spinal Cord Research at Johns Hopkins, smiled as she remembered her first consultation with Daniel 5 years earlier, her initial skepticism about Esperanza's observations, and her growing amazement as they had witnessed recovery that challenged everything she thought she knew about neural rehabilitation. The most important lesson we've learned, Esperanza continued, is that hope is not false kindness. It's essential medicine. Patients who believe in the possibility of recovery achieve better outcomes than those who accept their limitations as permanent. Hope activates neural plasticity, enhances the effectiveness of physical therapy, and creates the psychological conditions necessary for the body's own healing mechanisms to function optimally. She paused, looking out at an audience that included patients, families, and medical professionals from around the world. But hope alone isn't sufficient. Hope must be combined with expertise, with resources, with intensive rehabilitation protocols, and with the willingness to challenge conventional assumptions about what recovery looks like. The presentation continued for another 30 minutes, documenting the scientific basis for the Blackwood-Morales Protocol, the international expansion of their rehabilitation centers, and the ongoing research into neural regeneration that promised even more dramatic recoveries in the future. But the most powerful moment came during the question and answer session when a young doctor from Nigeria stood up to speak. "Dr. Morales, I have a patient, a 12-year-old boy, complete T6 injury from a bicycle accident. His family has spent everything they have on medical treatment, but they've been told there's no hope for recovery. Based on your presentation, do you think incomplete injury is possible in his case?" Esperanza's answer revealed both the scientific rigor and the compassionate humanity that had characterized her approach to medicine throughout her career. "I can't diagnose your patient from a conference presentation," she said. "But I can tell you that age is a significant factor in neural recovery, that pediatric spinal cord injuries have different healing potential than adult injuries, and that sophisticated reevaluation often reveals incomplete injuries that weren't detected in the acute phase following trauma." She paused, then added with conviction, "More importantly, I can tell you that 12-year-old children deserve every possible chance at recovery, that hope is medically indicated for young patients even when complete recovery seems unlikely, and that the Blackwood Foundation has scholarship programs specifically designed to bring patients from developing countries to our rehabilitation centers." The doctor sat down with tears in his eyes, and several audience members began applauding, not just for the medical information, but for the reminder that healing was about more than protocols and procedures. It was about seeing every patient as someone's child, someone's future, someone worthy of the most sophisticated treatment available, regardless of their ability to pay for it. After the presentation, as Esperanza fielded questions from journalists and researchers, Daniel found himself approached by a familiar figure, Marcus Romano, the man whose wife had betrayed Alexander Hartwell in Miami 5 years earlier, whose story had intersected with theirs in ways neither had expected. "Mr. Blackwood," Marcus said, extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you for what you've built here. My son Miguel, you might remember him from Isabella's case. He was injured in a soccer accident 2 years ago. Incomplete T8 injury." Daniel's expression grew concerned. "How is he doing?" "He's walking independently now, playing soccer again, planning to study biomedical engineering at University of Miami next year. He was treated at your center in Guatemala, using the protocols that Dr. Morales developed with you." Marcus paused, his voice thick with emotion. "You could have held our family's betrayal against us, could have refused treatment for my son because of what Isabella did to you. Instead, you saved his future. I don't know how to thank you for that." Daniel's response revealed the depth of healing that had occurred not just in his body, but in his spirit. "Your son needed medical care, not judgment about his mother's choices," Daniel said simply. "Children shouldn't pay the price for their parents' mistakes. I'm just grateful we could help." As the conference wound down and attendees began making their way to the evening reception, Esperanza found herself standing on the convention center's outdoor terrace, looking out at the Rocky Mountains and reflecting on the improbable journey that had brought her to this moment. 5 years ago, she had been invisible, a talented medical professional whose expertise was hidden behind immigration barriers and economic necessity, whose voice was silenced by circumstance rather than lack of knowledge or skill. Now, she was internationally recognized as a pioneer in neural rehabilitation, the director of research centers on 3 continents, the author of textbooks that were required reading in medical schools around the world. But more importantly, she had learned that healing was never finished, that second chances were always available, that the most important discoveries often came from the collaboration between people who refused to accept that impossible things had to stay impossible. Dr. Morales? She turned to find a young woman approaching. Emily Chen, Dr. Sarah Chen's daughter, now in her first year of medical school at Stanford. I wanted you to know that your work inspired me to specialize in rehabilitation medicine, Emily said. The idea that healing can happen when everyone else has given up, that hope can be engineered through the application of knowledge and determination, that's what I want to spend my career doing. Esperanza smiled, recognizing in Emily's enthusiasm the same passion that had driven her own career, the same commitment to believing that recovery was always possible, even when conventional wisdom suggested otherwise. "What's your biggest fear about going into rehabilitation medicine?" Esperanza asked. Emily's answer was immediate and honest. "That I'll give up on a patient too quickly, that I'll accept limitations as permanent when they might be temporary, that I'll stop believing in possibilities because I've seen too many cases where recovery didn't happen." "Then you're already ahead of most doctors," Esperanza said gently. "The ones who worry about giving up too early are the ones who usually don't. The ones who are afraid of losing hope are the ones who usually hold on to it the longest." As the mountain air grew cooler and the lights of Denver began to twinkle below them, Esperanza found herself thinking about all the patients who had passed through their rehabilitation centers, all the families who had been reunited with hope they thought they had lost, all the medical professionals who had learned to see possibilities where they had previously seen only problems. But mostly, she thought about Daniel, the angry, bitter man in a wheelchair who had become one of the most generous philanthropists in healthcare, whose personal recovery had created opportunities for thousands of other patients to discover their own possibilities for healing. Their partnership had proven that miracles weren't mystical events that happened to lucky people. They were engineered outcomes that resulted from the application of expertise, resources, determination, and the radical belief that healing was always possible when the right people refused to give up. Tomorrow, new patients would arrive at rehabilitation centers around the world, carrying their own stories of trauma and loss, their own fears that life as they had known it was over. And tomorrow, teams of medical professionals trained in the Blackwood-Morales protocol would begin the process of teaching them what Daniel had learned, what thousands of other patients had discovered, that the end of one life could be the beginning of another, that limitations could become launching points, that sometimes the most powerful healing happened when people chose to believe in recovery, even when recovery seemed impossible. The miracle was still happening, spreading around the world, one patient at a time, one family at a time, one moment of refusing to accept that healing was finished. And in a world that often forgot that second chances were possible, that recovery could happen at any age and under any circumstances, the work that had begun with 6 words whispered in a Beverly Hills mansion continued to prove that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations started with the simplest act of refusing to let someone else's hope die. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey of Esperanza and Daniel, where a housekeeper's medical expertise and a millionaire's resources combined to create miracles that changed thousands of lives around the world. If their story of hidden talent, second chances, and the power of refusing to give up has inspired you as much as it inspired me, I'd be so grateful if you could show your support by hitting that like button, subscribing to our channel for more amazing stories of ordinary people accomplishing extraordinary things, and sharing this video with anyone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late for healing, hope, or second chances. Esperanza's transformation from invisible housekeeper to internationally recognized medical pioneer reminds us that expertise can be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the person who changes your life forever is someone everyone else has overlooked. Thank you for being part of this community that believes in the power of seeing potential where others see only problems, and in the beautiful truth that healing is always possible when the right people refuse to stop believing. I'll see you in the next inspiring story.